Welcome, and thank you for standing with us to confront cruelty in all its disguises. Across the country, animals are suffering. In homes, on ranches, in public parks, harmed under the guise of tradition, culture, or even faith. But cruelty should never be excused, no matter the justification. Tonight's conversation dives into how harmful customs persist in our communities and what it takes to stop them. At Animal Wellness Action and the Center for a Humane Economy, we're not just talking, we're acting. Through groundbreaking legislation, we're working to protect animals from abuse, regardless of who the perpetrators are. Culture should never be a cover for cruelty. Whether you're joining us live or watching the replay, your voice matters, and tonight we'll tell you how to take action. Here is your host for tonight's event, Joseph Grove, host of the Animal Wellness Podcast.
Welcome to our event, folks. I am Joseph Grove, Senior Communications Director for Animal Wellness Action and the Center for a Humane Economy, and I am so glad you are with us. I'm really excited about this webinar. I'll introduce our panelists in a moment, but just a couple of quick notes before we get started. I want to note that this event is brought to you by Animal Wellness Action and the Center for a Humane Economy. It's part of our Claudia Miller Ignite series on animal welfare. For those of you who are new to us, thanks for joining the team. Welcome aboard. We're grateful. We hope you'll find the content tonight and the updates we send you to be educational and inspiring, and that you'll take advantage of its ability to connect you to your legislators and other officials to make heard your voice for animals. Next, please be aware we've set aside some time at the end of the event for you to ask questions. You should see in your Zoom window a QA button, question, chat, something like that. Enter your questions in that. At the end of the event, at about 45 minutes into it, we'll pose those to our panelists. We'll pose as many as we can. And if there are some I can answer along the way, I'm happy to do that as well. Finally, everyone who registered will receive an email tomorrow containing a link to this recording, as well as any information we've talked about that we want to make sure you have in your hands. So watch for that email. And please feel free to share that with anyone who has a similar heart for animals. We would love to have them on our team as well. Now, I'll introduce our speakers. Wayne Pacelli is the founder and president of Animal Wellness Action and the Center for a Humane Economy, recognized 7 times as one of the nation's top nonprofit executives. He's a 2-time New York Times bestselling author and has spearheaded 100 federal laws, 1,500 state laws for animal protection. Also with us is Elizabeth Milampi. She is a Harvard-educated attorney with background in animal and environmental law. She has worked on issues affecting farmed, wild, and captive animals through Harvard's Animal Law and Policy Clinic. Her first book, and what we hope is a long and successful career, is Forget the Camel, the Madcap World of Animal Festivals and What They Say About Being Human. Scott Edwards is our general counsel. He is an environmental and animal protection attorney with more than 30 years of advocacy experience. His work has spanned the globe, partnering with advocates in countries including India, Bangladesh, China, and Mexico. Scott's commentary has appeared in the New York Times, Huffington Post, and other major news outlets. I think you'll really benefit from hearing what our guests today have to say. I'm going to turn it over to Wayne now, who will kick us off with some thoughts on the topic, and then we'll move right through the agenda. Wayne, over to you.
Joseph, thank you for organizing this, and thanks to Ryan, and great to be with Elizabeth on this panel and my colleague Scott, and welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Animal Wellness Action is a 501c4 organization that advances public policies to stop animal cruelty and to enforce anti-cruelty laws. It also gets involved in political advocacy, getting involved in elections and trying to push people into office who care about animals and to push people out of office who don't care about animals. The Center for Humane Economy is a charitable organization, a 501c3 organization. It focuses on corporate advocacy, like our very successful Kangaroos Are Not Shoes campaign that just racked up a series of wins with Adidas, Mizuno, and ASICS agreeing to stop sourcing kangaroo skins for their athletic shoes. So I really have long believed that the twin pillars of reform in animal protection our government advocacy, because government plays such a big role in society and sets standards, legal standards, which prescribe certain bad behaviors. And then corporate policy, working with corporations to build animal welfare into their supply chain decisions, their R&D programs, and other operations. I'll say that one of the big areas of focus for us is systemic cruelty. We're looking at large-scale, economically driven forms of mistreatment of animals like factory farming, animal testing, abuses in wildlife management, fashion like killing of animals for fur or killing kangaroos for their skins for athletic shoes, and other large-scale forms of cruelty where you're not motivated so much by malice, but really by economic incentives and profits. Tonight, I'm really glad that Joseph Grove, my colleague, has organized our discussion in this Claudia Miller series on matters dealing with kind of entertainment or ritualized uses of animals or even faith-based uses of animals. And, you know, many of us have had discussions and debates with people. We've heard counterpoints to animal protection arguments about, say, stopping bullfighting. You know, some people who are enthusiasts for bullfighting will say, well, this is part of my culture. This has been going on for hundreds of years, or in some cases, people talk about thousands of years. And, you know, we say, yes, it's been part of a larger cultural matrix, but it's hardly essential to the culture. It doesn't mean that the culture just goes away or is destroyed or is impaired in any way. And we are holding up practices in every part of the United States and all parts of the world to a basic standard of decent treatment of animals because we're elevating and attempting to elevate the status of animals. And whether it's bullfighting or it's cockfighting or it's dogfighting or it's live pigeon shoots or it's steer tailing or animal sacrifice, someone must speak up for the animals. And tonight, I'm really excited to hear Joseph's interviews with Elizabeth and Scott about these questions. And we're going to continue to concentrate on large-scale economic uses of animals and big-scale billions or millions of animals. But we do not forget in any way these smaller numbers of animals used, often in particularly cruel ways. And before I turn it over to Joseph, I just want to mention that yesterday we had a press conference about cockfighting in Oklahoma. And our brave investigators got into a cockfighting pit in eastern Oklahoma, not all that far from the Arkansas border. It was a very dangerous setting with people who are enjoying terrible acts of violence and are drawn to that site because of violence. And we documented that the two leading political advocates to weaken our national and state anti-cockfighting laws, who claimed that they were not defending cockfighting, they were defending game fowl and the personal freedoms, but they don't support any illegal activity. We caught them red-handed at this cockfight. And we've heard all sorts of defenses. This is our culture from more outspoken, outwardly facing people who defend cockfighting. And I just don't think it holds up. And tonight we're going to get into that question. So Joseph, let me turn it back to you and thank you again for organizing a very important discussion.
You bet, Wayne. Thank you very much for that excellent setup. Elizabeth, you and I had a chance to talk on the Animal Wellness podcast about your book, and we'll put a link to your book in the email that goes out tomorrow. But why don't you hold up a copy for it, right? Because, you know, we're not paying you. You might as well get a little promotion out of this. So there it is. Forget the Camel. And you've got the subhead there. What is the subhead to the book?
The Madcap World of Animal Festivals and What They Say About Being Human.
All right. Well, it was a fascinating interview we had. Talk about, well, what does Forget the Camel mean? Why does that start your book title?
So the book title comes from one of the festivals that I attended. So my book is about American animal festivals, and I focus on 8 of them. So I went to all of these events, and I sort of witnessed what was happening, and interviewed people, went to these communities, all of that. And one of the events is a camel race, basically. It's called the International Camel and Ostrich Races. It's in Virginia City, Nevada, just outside of Reno. And what they do is they basically mount, camels and ostriches on their backs, and they race them around this track. And it's not, it's not a race for speed. It's a race. It's very slapstick humor. The sort of one of the assumed parts of the event is that people will fall off. People will sort of go, kind of, lose control of themselves on the backs of these animals who very much do not want to be ridden. And during one of these races, I was watching, and predictably, a human jockey was thrown from the back of a camel, fell, 5 or 6 feet to the ground, and was lying on the ground. And the handlers rushed to control the camel. They rushed to get the camel back under control, walk it back to the start line so it could be mounted again for the next heat. And the MC yelled out, "Check on Charlie, forget the camel," Charlie being the human who had fallen. And I just thought it was a great sort of anecdote to title the book after, because it really encapsulates like the sort of common theme of what goes on at these animal festivals, which is that we put an animal front and center. We say we are here to celebrate this animal, to do something to this animal. But at the same time, it sort of demands that we actually ignore the animal's interests almost entirely, because if we really cared about the animal, we couldn't be doing what we do to them at these events. And so that kind of dual attention, where we both really care about them, they're front and center, but also we're really decentering their interests and focusing on our own, is kind of the tension that I wanted to capture with that title.
Thank you. I am deathly afraid of snakes. One was in our garage the other day. I screamed and leapt into the arms of my protective wife. That said, I had a great deal of agony listening to you talk about the Rattlesnake Festival. Describe that, if you would please, for our viewers.
The Rattlesnake Roundup in Sweetwater, Texas, they call themselves the world's largest rattlesnake roundup. It's basically an event. Rattlesnake roundups happen kind of throughout the South now, and they're these kind of culturally rooted historical events that have been happening for about 100 years. The Sweetwater Roundup is, I think, 65 or 67 years old, something like that. And it's basically an event where they hunt rattlesnakes from the surrounding environment. So what they do is they use gasoline and they pump it into the snake dens, which then forces the snakes to come out of the dens to get fresh air. And then they're sort of stunned and they don't know what's going on. The humans capture them and bring them in alive to this sort of central snake pit in the middle of town. And the snakes are in the snake pit, and the point of the roundup weekend is to kill all the snakes in the snake pit. And they don't kill them in a particularly humane way. They kill them in a very sort of theatrical way. So what they do is they behead the snakes with kind of like a machete, a knife sort of thing on just like a stump. And so they behead the snakes, which obviously kills them, although it's not the most humane way to kill a snake. And then they skin the snakes sort of right in front of tourists. Tourists can pay and to sort of like do the skinning themselves. Like some people really like that. Find it kind of part of the touristic appeal of the event to kind of get your hands dirty and feel what that experience is like. They then pull out, all the muscle, and they deep fry the muscle and sell snake meat, which a lot of people also find to be a compelling piece of the event. So this Rattlesnake Roundup is centered around this act of killing snakes. Although there's a lot else going on the weekend, that's sort of the core activity.
Mm-hmm. What other festivals did you attend? You mentioned the ostrich racing. We talked about the rattlesnake event. What other festivals did you attend?
I attended the Iditarod Dog Sled Race in Alaska, the Maine Lobster Festival in Rockland, Maine. I attended the Camel and Ostrich races, then a Jumping Frog Jubilee in Calaveras County, California, where they jump frogs competitively. And then Groundhog Day in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and a Butterfly Days parade in Pacific Grove, California. Very sort of quaint, festival welcoming the return of the migrating monarch butterflies. So a real range of festivals. And the book is structured in sort of 3 key parts, which I sort of chose as kind of microcosms of how we relate to animals more generally. So the 3 parts are dominance, humor, and reverence. And those festivals are sort of sorted into those parts as ways to help explore them.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at some of these, for example, the Rattlesnake Festival and the Lobster Festival, and of course, people have been eating lobster for years. What takeaways about human nature, if any, did you come away with? Right? What did you learn about what it means to be human, seeing how the animals were treated in each of the 3 categories you described?
It's a big question. I mean, I think the lessons are really complicated and sort of multifold. Like sort of, I think they all really differ depending on the festival, and I think each section has its sort of its own unique lesson. So the dominant section is where the rattlesnake roundup happens, and that's where I put the Maine Lobster Festival, which I argue is actually, it feels really different. The vibe is different, but at the end of the day, you're bringing a bunch of wild animals in alive. You're killing them in public. You're sort of eating the flesh. Like the actual core events are the same, despite our kind of cultural assumptions that make it okay to eat lobster and maybe like a novelty to eat snake. The actual act is the same. And then with humor, I think the core lesson is sort of about how we can really forget animals' interests. Like we really can use sort of humor to make things seem not so bad. Often when you're sort of like the dominance section is in some ways really easy because you're clearly killing animals, you're clearly doing things that hurt them. And there might be justifications that people offer for that, but the outcome is clear. The humor section, you get away from killing, and now suddenly we have this concept of welfare approaching. We have the idea that, the frogs being raised or jumped in these competitive frog jumping contests should be treated well. They're kept in a frog spa between their heats. You have all like a huge frog welfare code. You have glimmers of the idea that animals actually have their own interests. And I think the humor section is really kind of like the meat of the book in some ways, because it's like where the action is happening. I think the dominance is easy to understand. The reverence in some ways is also a little easier to understand, but the humor is sort of like animals in transition. And so I think that was a really fruitful place to focus some time on. And then the reverence section, I think ultimately one of the things I explore in the book is that the word reverence, we often think of the animals we love as those receiving the most attention. And so I went to Groundhog Day in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, who's basically a celebrity. I mean, everyone loves Punxsutawney Phil. They have T-shirts, they wear little groundhog outfits. It's a sort of a really big event that everyone loves Punxsutawney Phil, this individual groundhog. But there is this idea that reverence maybe is actually just kind of dominance in disguise if you're not thinking about what the animal might want. So, Phil is kept in a artificial burrow his whole life. He's kept in this little plexiglass tube on Groundhog Day. It's not the same as really kind of caring for the animal for the animal's sake in their own environment, habitat, sort of sets of interests and wants. And so I think this, like the core lesson, I guess, is that all of these areas have ways that we use and abuse animals kind of unthinkingly. It's just we do it because we've always done it. And so I think the core lesson that I wanted to take out is that humanity sometimes, we need to look at animals to figure out who we are. And that's a theme I come back to again and again in the book. And I think that piece might be inevitable, but we don't have to hurt and kill animals to figure out who we are. And I think so that's the sort of the core, I guess, sort of point of my book is to try to separate those two things. Animals will always be a part of our lives, symbolic and practical lives, but they don't have to be the victims of those symbols, those sort of like practical interests that we have as humans.
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox, right? Because on one hand, we are very interested in them. They mesmerize us, they delight us. But the challenge seems to be behind a lot of these events is how to enjoy animals without harming them and exploiting them. You talked about joyful and disturbing aspects of these festivals. Was there one particular event that was the most difficult for you to experience?
I think the rattlesnake roundup in Sweetwater, Texas was probably the most difficult, in part because the killing was so sort of obvious, which sounds a little silly probably, but I mean, it just happened sort of right in front of you. And I think there was a lot of reveling in that violence, in that killing. That was sort of the atmosphere of the event was very much to partake in that violence, to sort of witness it and to test a piece of it for yourself. And I think that atmosphere was nothing like anything I'd ever experienced, and felt really foreign to the way that I go through the world, thinking about animals as, peers of some sort. And so I think that was hard for me sort of emotionally. I think the Iditarod dog sled race was also a hard one, if not so deeply emotionally with the experience of violence, a little more sort of cognitively, because when the dogs take off, they look okay. The Iditarod is a 1,000-mile dog sled race through rural Alaska, and the dogs, who start the race end the race. It's not a relay, and so these dogs really suffer on the trail. That many of them die and experience huge hardships. And that race felt so kind of complicated to watch the start of, because everyone, the dogs were safe at the start, but I sort of knew what was coming. And I flew home. The race is over a week long, so I didn't, travel along the course or anything or see the finish, but it sort of made you really think. It was really kind of a somber experience in some ways. So I think those events were the hardest for different reasons.
Sure. Now, as you look at festivals in general, the Iditarod, let's say maybe in particular, there seems to be some gradual shifting of attitudes about them. Has that been your observation? And if so, how is it manifesting?
Yeah, absolutely. It has been my observation. I do think attitudes are changing towards a lot of these festivals. I think, on the one hand, advocates have done a huge amount of work to sort of push the narrative on these festivals. So the Iditarod is a great example. I mean, PETA's had ongoing campaigns for years against the Iditarod, and major corporate sponsors have backed out. There's all sorts of sort of, I think, like market pressure, sort of public, like PR pressure to sort of distance themselves from this race that does kill dogs. I mean, dogs die not every year, but close. And over hundreds of dogs have died, or over 150 dogs, I think, have died in the history of the race. And again, even those who live really suffer. So it's not a sort of, it's not a simple event where we can sort of come down on it in favor of it so easily. But I think it's that changing norms, those changing norms are really slow and hard sometimes. And I think what often happens, and what I saw happen in the sort of slice of research that I did, was a lot of sort of then re-entrenched, kind of reinforced, this is our heritage, this is our culture, this is important, from the people who put it on and from the people who watch the race, care about the race every year. And so the improved welfare is, I think, a sign of change, absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, the event will change for the better in the short term. I think it can entrench those sort of deeply held norms about the experience of the event.
Sure. People talk about the cultural value of these events. Was interviewing once a woman who ran a sanctuary for rescued fighting roosters, and she had gotten to know some of the cockfighters, and the cockfighters really presented to her what might be, on face of it, a sympathetic argument that this is something that fathers hand down to sons, that in many rural areas where there's nothing to do, where drug use is common, that they found value in having something to do with their children that was familial, traditional, that kept them out of danger. How would you have responded to that notion of culture being a justifier before the book, and how would you respond to it now?
I think similarly, I think my answer to that question is, at some point, culture has to stop being a good enough justification. And that has happened many times in human history. Culture continues to evolve and change. In American history alone, we've had significant shifts in what we view as just or right or legal. And I think those changes are really sort of inevitable with this sort of like, moral arc towards justice. That being said, I think that we do a disservice to sort of forget the depth of those emotions on the side of the people who are doing these things, doing these things that we might see as harmful or abusive, or whatever the word may be. I think that, everyone, I'm sympathetic to this story that you just told, because lots of the people that I met throughout my research were I would say all of them were like very nice, kind of normal people. I think they all cared really deeply about their communities. They cared really deeply about the good that these events would do, which they all did good. They all raised money for their communities. They brought in really important income. A lot of these towns are small, and they get 40, 50,000 people coming through the town for these weekends. That's really important. They get a lot of sort of community building and identity identity building through these festivals, through these events that are so core to their history. And then, it's just like fathers pass rituals down to sons. I think at these events, they're almost all really targeted towards families. It's families teaching their children how to be, from Alaska or from Sweetwater, Texas, or, wherever the case may be. That idea of heritage, culture, tradition, passing that down to the next generation, teaching them how to interact with animals is a really core part of what's going on at these events. So I think the core kind of lesson from that I try to explain in my book is that, culture can't be enough. That can't be the only reason that we do something harmful to animals. And if it is, I think, there's serious reasons that we should start reconsidering that and think about how we can honor the best of our past, the best of our culture, without being stuck in sort of regressive, harmful habits just for the sake of following our own habits, which I think ultimately is what a lot of tradition is. And the other thing I'll say before finishing this long-winded answer is that I think culture, that's an excuse that a lot of us have with all sorts of things. And so, like, culture is a reason to eat turkey on Thanksgiving or to eat, chicken wings at the Super Bowl. I think it's so easy with these animal festivals to look at them as if there's something totally foreign that's like happening in Sweetwater, Texas, and not relevant to me. But the culture piece is often a defense that we get as animal advocates, we get from family members, friends, et cetera. It's sort of like this idea that it is so important to me to eat this particular food or to watch this particular entertainment program or whatever the sort of the thing is. And I think culture is not a good enough answer in all those circumstances too. So once we start kind of peeling back the layer of culture, I think you can get to this idea that how we treat animals is actually largely pretty arbitrary and negative, and we have the power to change it. It's just as simple as making a different decision.
Elizabeth, thank you. I really appreciate it. Your book is Forget the Camel. I'll put the full title and a link in the email we'll send tomorrow. I'm really grateful, and I hope you'll hang around with us to answer any questions regarding your book until the end of the webinar. Thank you for that. Scott Edwards, one of my guilty pleasure movies is The Devil's Advocate. It's Al Pacino. It is scene chewing best. You've got Keanu Reeves, who plays a lawyer recruited by the devil's law firm. And one of his first cases, Keanu Reeves, is to defend a man who is accused of animal abuse. And Keanu does all of his legal research, and lo and behold, he gets the guy off because of the religious exemption. The religious exemption for the treatment of animals, the mistreatment of animals, has come into focus for us recently because of coverage we've provided on the sacrifice of bald eagles and hawks in the West by some Native American tribes. And that's why I thought of you for this show, because I don't think people really understand that there is a way to perhaps execute what we would call cruelty to an animal and then justify it as a religious exercise. Let me ask you to start us off, Scott. What is the law and how is it balanced when it comes to the interest of the animal and the First Amendment right to freedom of religious exercise?
Right. Thanks, Joseph. I'm sure everybody on this webinar knows that the United States is very protective of religious practices and religious rights. It's embodied in the Constitution under the First Amendment, our Free Exercise Clause, which sets it up as a constitutional right. Congress has gone even further in 1993 with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which creates extremely high protections for any kind of religious activity and for government and preventing government interference of religious activities and practices. The states themselves, 28 states have passed state-level laws that are very similar to the federal 1993 law. In addition, 10 states have similar protections for religious practices in their state constitutions. So we're starting from a position of a practice that is very highly protective and insulated from any type of government regulation, limitations, both at the federal and state level. So we're already starting off in a difficult place where we look to see how, as lawyers, and as your favorite movie apparently showed, on how we can engage and try to stop these kinds of activities as a lawyer in a courtroom. Those high standards have been interpreted by the Supreme Court in a case in Florida back in 1993, in which a local ordinance was enacted to try to stop the practice of Santeria in the community. And the Supreme Court came back and struck down those ordinances and laid out the test that now exists for not only for this, but for many constitutional protections. And that test is that the government need show what's called a compelling governmental interest in limiting that constitutional right. And once they've made that showing, they have to enact laws that are extremely narrow in order to try to stop that behavior.
What was,
that is an
let me ask.
extremely high. Okay,
Yeah,
sure.
thank you, Scott. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you
No.
unnecessarily. The practice of Santeria you mentioned was the essence of the case in Florida.
Mhm.
What is Santeria?
It's a religious practice that involves the sacrifice of animals under the belief that it can contribute to the healing of afflicted people.
Right, okay.
It is.
So there were groups doing it down there.
Mhm.
Those groups were challenged, and I take it the groups were ultimately victorious and were told, go ahead and
Right.
keep doing it.
So the city passed an ordinance directed at prohibiting or banning the practice of Santeria, and the church that was targeted brought a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the ordinance, and the court struck it down.
Okay, so it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court handed down this test and
Mhm.
the compelling interest. So what are examples of compelling interests that might justify a government's intervention in something otherwise constitutionally protected?
Generally, public health, safety, welfare, national security, those types of interests, and the court. The argument from the city was that there was a compelling interest by the city and the city council to stop this kind of practice for lots of different quote compelling reasons. And the court came back and said, well, you're stopping the slaughter of animals in a single context. You still allow in this city slaughterhouses to exist. You allow the killing of animals through hunting, through all these other practices. So you still haven't articulated the quote compelling interest that would allow you to focus simply on the killing of animals in this one scenario.
Right. So if I can slit a cow's throat or a deer's throat for meat, and I allow that, then it would seem to be discriminatory, perhaps, if I were to try and shut that down if it occurred in a religious ceremony. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, that's about right, Joseph. It looked at the first thing it said about the law is that and it put the court on a footing right off the bat that there was a problem with this ordinance is that there was no what they call general applicability of the law. It was very much a targeted law, and that's one of the first things they look at when they're looking at the constitutionality of an ordinance or a law is does it have general applicability? So, for example, a state animal cruelty law that applies equally to everybody has general applicability. Child labor laws. We have a whole host of laws that are generally applicable across the board to all kinds of activities. When you pass a law that targets, in this case, a religious practice, that's a giant red flag for the court.
And let me just, Joseph, if forgive me, I just wanted
Please.
to mention Scott is stirring my thinking about one of our campaigns. In 2018, we worked to pass an amendment to the Farm Bill to extend the prohibitions on cockfighting and dogfighting to the U.S. territories. And cockfighters in Puerto Rico first, then in the U.S. territory of Guam, and then in the Northern Marianas Islands, all challenged that law. And Scott, we prevailed in the district courts and the appellate courts. And I think, I recall the compelling state interest argument, right? That the cockfighters in Puerto Rico were arguing, a number of things, but a big one was cultural tradition. And the Congress had said, hey, this is important as a matter of animal cruelty. It's important as a matter of public health because of the disease spread for the birds. And the same thing played out in Guam and Northern Marianas Islands. But I'd love to just
Yeah.
here, if you think that is an example of a federal statute that was fairly applied and that had those compelling interests.
It was, it was. If you recall, I know you do. One of the main thrusts of the argument in favor of the government being able to do this was the public health concerns about shipping birds internationally and across state lines and throughout the country to engage in these practices. And we've talked a lot in our campaign about the human health threats that kind of behavior brings. And it was generally applicable. Nobody could do it. That law didn't target a single group of folks. It targeted the transportation of animals for fighting generally. And so that is a law of general applicability that has a compelling interest behind it, which enabled us to uphold all of those applications of those laws to all those territories.
Okay, so let me help me understand here, Scott, because I did watch several episodes of Judge Judy to prep for
Uh-oh.
interviewing you. But so if I'm a city, I can't prevent a religion from doing something that is otherwise a-okay just because it's perhaps the religion doing it. If I am the church, let's say, that doesn't mean I can get away with things though that are prohibited generally. Am I understanding you right there?
Yeah, generally that's right. So if you have a law of general applicability, the churches can be held accountable for those. But you also have to remember that not only do we have this First Amendment and RFRA, which provides all these protections, but our governments have also, for example, under the Federal Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, exempt religious entities, and they allow for kosher and halal practices of slaughter under that bill. So not only have we set up these religious protections, but even when we do pass some laws around the slaughter of animals, for example, and states have followed suit in several states with the federal exemptions. Our legislators are carving out exemptions even to those generally applicable provisions. In some cases, not in all cases.
And final question for you before we turn to Wayne for talking about some of the laws that we're actually trying to get passed. Let me ask you to go out on a limb, Scott, and if you don't want to go with me, that's fine. But considering the sacrifice by these Native American tribes out in the West, I think it's the Hopi tribe who is sacrificing the bald eagles and the hawks, part of the religious ceremony. Would a compelling interest be the protected status of the birds? Would that be an argument prosecutors or attorneys could bring to bear to stop this sacrifice?
It would, except for one unfortunate wrinkle here, and that is that while we have generally applicable laws that attach to particularly endangered species and threatened species, migratory birds, for example, the government has the ability and exercises it fairly freely to give out what they call take permits, which allow for people to kill these animals. And in the case that we're talking about, those tribes are given permission through these take permits to kill these animals. But for that, I think there would be a good argument about general applicability of endangered species protection and migratory bird protection that applies to everybody. So we've got that as a hurdle to get over.
All right. Well, thank you. If you have any questions for Scott or for Elizabeth, please do put them in the chat. We'll go to them at the end of the next segment, in which Wayne Pasali is going to talk about several legislative initiatives we have and which we'll ask you tomorrow in our email to support to help law enforcement crack down on animal abusers. Wayne, what have you got cooking on the Hill?
Well, Joseph, your questions were so good, and the responses from Elizabeth and Scott were so compelling. It made me think of just a little bit more before getting to those bills on the line of questioning that you advanced. I haven't read Elizabeth's book yet, but I'm excited to do so. But I did read some years ago a book by Anthony Appiah called The Honor Code. And he talked about 4 different traditions that fell out of favor over time. One was Atlantic slavery. Of course, this is not a festival. This was kind of a structural exploitation of a race of people in a large region of the country. He also talked about dueling as a way to resolve conflicts. Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton, at the start of the formation of our country, and also talked about foot binding in China, and then honor killing, which is a way to kind of mete out retribution against a woman who engages in some behavior that the men in the family judge to be demeaning to them, or just objectionable, and the young woman is killed. Appiah basically argued that these practices fell out of favor because they became shameful. It wasn't so much that, of course, we fought a civil war over slavery, so that was the resolution there. And then there were legal strictures that were put in place, and of course, there were legal standards that were established in the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But traditions change, as Elizabeth said, and there must be moral clarity in challenging these orthodoxies that develop. And there's got to be sufficient courage to challenge them. And whether it results in, a law or just the falling away of the practice because it becomes shameful, it's the same outcome, but just different means of achieving it. We obviously have a wide range of prohibited activities when it comes to mistreating animals. I mean, dogfighting, cockfighting are the most widespread forms of cruelty that are criminalized. USDA says 20 to 25 million fighting birds in the United States, 150,000 backyard operations. We're talking systemic scale participation in cockfighting. So we've got a law there. But now we've got a great national law against animal fighting, but we're, Joseph, taking it a step further with the Fight Act, which Scott and I worked to formulate. We worked with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. In fact, today, the U.S. House version of the Fight Act was introduced. Tomorrow we'll have a bill number with an amazing roster of Republicans and Democrats who were original co-sponsors of the bill. This is going to amp up our enforcement capacity. It is so important, if we're going to root out dogfighting and cockfighting, to pass the Fight Act. It creates a private right of action to target dogfighters and cockfighters for the first time ever, when we don't have law enforcement or federal law enforcement agents taking appropriate measures to address known forms of animal fighting. It also bans shipment of adult roosters through the U.S. Postal Service. The Postal Service is taking tens of thousands of cockfighting birds and moving them. The cockfighters put them in boxes and ship them from North Carolina to Guam, or from California to Hawaii, or Vermont to Texas, where the cartels then come over the border and run them down to the fighting pits that they control in Mexico. So that's one, but I'm also super excited about the Animal Cruelty Enforcement Act, the ACE Act, which would create a special prosecutors unit at the Department of Justice, specifically calls for it at the Environment and Natural Resources Division within DOJ, to have dedicated prosecutors focused on the National Animal Fighting Law, the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act, which is our national animal cruelty law, and a wide range of other statutes that forbid various forms of animal cruelty and other forms of exploitation. And then just a couple weeks ago, we worked to introduce yet another bill. These are all formulations of Animal Wellness Action and the Center for a Humane Economy. The other one is the other side of the enforcement scheme from the prosecutors. It's the policing and the investigations. So this is the FBI Animal Cruelty Task Force Act. So the FBI Act. And this creates a special unit at the FBI to focus on animal cruelty crimes. So as that little opening song or ditty and narration in the opening of the TV series Law and Order, there are two groups that are important for law enforcement. They're the police that investigate, make arrests, and the prosecutors who then bring the charges and drive convictions. We need both of those when it comes to our animal cruelty laws. And a few years ago, we didn't have enough laws to warrant this sort of capacity on the policing and prosecuting side. But because of the work that we've done over the years, now we do. And it's time for all three of these laws to pass, but we've got to create a national clamor for it. Where you have thousands and thousands of bills introduced in the Congress. The ones that get attention have people advocating for them, advocating for activity, co-sponsorship, demanding votes. The only way we win politically and get these new policies, these national policies that will have enormous implications for millions of animals, is if we demand it. Don't leave it up to us at Animal Wellness Action, our professional staff like Scott and Joseph and others. They're doing as much as they can, but we need thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who are engaged with us, who collectively exert pressure on the political system to change the laws. And I can tell you, I've been doing this for a long time. That's what succeeds. And we have a great opportunity with these anti-cruelty laws, this set of three, the FIGHT Act, the ACE Act, and the FBI Act, to address these problems. So Joseph, I'm super excited about the bipartisan teams of lawmakers who've introduced these bills. I'm talking to them all the time, and now it's up to all of us to really propel them.
Thank you, Wayne. And that's why we are always so grateful for the support of our people who have been with us for years and the people who are just joining us even today, because we run a very frugal operation. We spend money where it counts. That's on the Hill. That's working with lawmakers. That's making sure that our voice is heard, and not only our voice, but your voice, you at home, you with the power to email and make phone calls. And one of the questions we have is, how can we advocate for these acts that Wayne is talking about? Just email and call them. Those are two great ways, right? We'll send you tomorrow links where you can just click, enter your name, and we have a letter that will be generated on your behalf and sent right to the staff and to these representatives and senators themselves to make your opinion heard. Phone calls certainly help as well, and communicating through Facebook, through Instagram, through your social networks. Your belief that these bills need to pass is another way to do it. Wayne, am I leaving anything out there?
No, excellent exhortation, Joseph. But again, don't leave it just to these constituent communications in the form of a letter. Go to a town hall, get involved in political campaigns. There's a real depth of engagement that you can have in the political process. And, more than ever, the public is with us on these issues. There are very few people who think that animal cruelty is acceptable. When people hear about our kangaroos are not shoes campaign, they're like, how could kangaroos be killed for this purpose? When people hear about the rattlesnake roundups in Sweetwater, they say, my God, that just seems so awful and so cruel that, those snakes are part of the ecosystem, and, they have gas put down their burrows, and then they're chopped up, and people have this reveling and excitement about it, when there's a being that's suffering here, that's being victimized in a terrible way, that's feeling terror and pain. And I think we're just there in all these places to remind people that the animals matter. And it's got to take many forms, right? Writing a letter to the editor, writing an op-ed, getting to know your lawmaker. If you have the means, donating to their campaigns. This is the way that political movements succeed, is through engagement. And Joseph, you're right. I mean, it's those forms that we make available, those alerts, people can send them to 10 friends and family members, right? And then they'll get on our list, and they can be involved in the next campaign. It's in so many ways, it's volume and numbers. People have to hear what's going on.
Very good. One of the forms of entertainment with animals we did not discuss is horse racing. And Wayne, we as an organization have supported HISA, the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act. When the racetrack that's very close to me, Churchill Downs, had a spate of horse deaths a couple of years ago, we were very active on that. How does horse racing as a form of entertainment figure in? And maybe that's a question also for Elizabeth. Did you think about horse racing, Elizabeth, when you were putting together your book?
I did. I thought about it quite a bit. I did not include any of the major horse races for the book, in large part because I think people have a lot of preconceived ideas about horse races. Same reason I didn't include the rodeo, which I think is another like giant sort of category of animal festival. I really wanted to pick events that were a little that people wouldn't have so much brain junk about already, so that they could engage with the arguments kind of fresh, sort of as we went through the book. So I didn't include it, but I did think about it a lot, and I think there's a lot to be said about horse racing and the harms that it does.
Yeah, and Joseph, I mean, this is one reason why animal wellness action is so important to the country and to animals. I mean, we were one of the architects of the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, which was the first federal law to impose any standards on horse racing when it comes to the treatment of the animals, who are the ones at the center of the enterprise. They're the ones who generate all the wealth. They're the ones who generate the entertainment. Yet it's like, okay, what are the standards here? You can dope them on race day. You can run them into the ground. I mean, this law set up the first safety standards at the tracks to deal with the wide range of problems. I mean, doping was the major one, but HISA, the authority, now has control over many different sorts of safety rules. And whether you're completely against horse racing, where many of our supporters are very critical and concerned of it, or whether you like it, we can all agree that there must be safety standards. And we don't want to see, our horse racing tracks turn into crash sites every single day. And there are some great organizations. Horse Racing Wrongs has done really important work in this realm. We work with them, but we also have worked with the Jockey Club, which are, it's horse racing establishment, because they supported these new standards against many of the other tracks that didn't want any standards at all. And certainly the standard bred tracks, Joseph, were and remain awful, and they are not even covered. It's really just the thoroughbreds that are covered, not the quarter horse races, not the standard breds, which was the harness racing track. So we've got a lot of work to do in this space still.
I would be remiss if I did not bring up the work we've done on greyhound racing, which is very similar, if not worse, to what we're talking about with horses. Wayne, we're close to killing off greyhound racing. Is that not correct?
We are, and I credit two of my dear friends, Carrie Teal and Christine Dorchak. They have devoted their adult lives. They've got a group called Grey 2K USA. I've worked with them for many, many years, and they have been the preeminent leaders on this issue. We teamed up, Animal Wellness Action teamed up with Grey 2K USA and other groups, but we really led the effort in Florida to ban greyhound racing in that state. And this was in 2018. And at that time, there were 18 greyhound tracks in the US, 12 were in Florida. So this was just an amazing opportunity to eliminate 2/3 of the problem in the nation overnight. That's what happened. 69% of Floridians, because of a very strong campaign that we ran, approved this ballot measure. And now there are just 2 tracks. And when I was kind of getting going in the cause in the 1980s, there were about 60 tracks. So when you look at metrics in terms of the progress, and Elizabeth mentioned progress and cultural awareness about these problems, this is a great example to go from 60 tracks to 2. And now soon the Greyhound Protection Act will be introduced in the Congress to eliminate it all, and also to ban simulcasting at foreign tracks, because we don't want U.S. gamblers to prop up foreign tracks, whether they're in Australia or the UK or China or Vietnam or elsewhere.
One of our viewers asked about how we coordinate with other animal welfare groups, and I think our collaboration with Grey 2K is an example of that. Switch for Good is not an animal-focused group, but it's another example of a partnership. Wayne, how do you approach the matter of collaborating and expanding our influence with these other organizations?
Well, it's really a broad-minded approach. It's not just animal welfare groups like Grey 2K and Switch for Good, which is kind of, I think, animal welfare, but as you say, also kind of performance and nutrition based. They're concerned about dairy and the mistreatment of cows, and how we've re-engineered the cow who, 50 years ago a cow might have been producing 4,000 or 5,000 pounds of milk a year. Now it's 25 to 30,000 pounds for a single cow. They have all sorts of ambulation problems. They have leg problems, foot problems. The females have mastitis, which is inflammation of the udders, and they're spent because they have such enormous production. Physiologically, it taxes their body so much. So many of those cows are going to slaughter at 3, 4, and 5 years of age, even though cows can live, 15, 18, 20 years potentially. So, it's not great for the cows, right? You're harming them in the sense of really taxing them and causing them a lot of ailments. And then they're being slaughtered not too much later than beef cattle would be slaughtered. They're often killed they're sent to the slaughterhouse at 2. So these dairy cows are sent at 3 or 4 for lower grade ground beef. Anyway, Joseph, your question is about collaboration. We must have collaboration, right? And it's with those sorts of groups and other animal groups, but it's also with the National Sheriff's Association, which is our partner on the Fight Act. It's with the District Attorneys Association, which is also an endorser of the Fight Act. It's with public health groups, because animal issues intersect with so many other concerns. There's so many academic disciplines that contribute to animal protection, right? As wildlife biologists and veterinarians and criminal justice, folks, and sociologists, rural sociologists. Our work is so broad. And when people say, oh, they think that animal issues are narrow. No, animals have always been at the center of the human story. And animals are part of this planet of life that we live on, right? We're one species. There are 10,000 bird species. There are 6,400 mammal species. There are millions of insects, and we have hundreds of thousands of plants. I mean, we are one species in this web of life, with this thin green layer of life and blue layer of life on our planet. And it's fragile. And there's an ecological argument, but there's also a cruelty argument and a caring for creation argument. And that's, really what we're about, Joseph, as you know, as our Senior Director of Communications. I mean, we want people to think about animals. We want them to understand that they have cognitive abilities, they have wants and desires like we have. And maybe they're not as smart as we are in the ways that we measure intelligence, but all the more reason to care for them. I mean, with power comes responsibility, and we have power, and that means we have a commensurate responsibility to care for this web of life on this planet. So that's what we're doing every day, and that's why we want everyone to be part of this effort, because we can't do it alone.
We are almost out of time. I want to toss one question to Elizabeth, and then Wayne, throw one to you that you'll be tempted to spend some time on, but maybe for the sake of time we can address quickly. For Elizabeth, one viewer was surprised by the number of dogs you cite as expiring, dying during the Iditarod. What do those dogs suffer, and what are the causes of that lethality?
Sure, yeah. Some of the leading causes of death for dogs on the Iditarod are asphyxiation from breathing in their own vomit as they run. Dogs also are involved in vehicle strikes sometimes with snowmobiles on the trail. They also sometimes suffer like cardiac issues, heart attacks, things like that. There's also lots of sort of long-term health effects, even if the dog doesn't die sort of on the course, which is, I think, grounds for automatic forfeiture of the race. Like the musher who is responsible for a dog who expires on the trail no longer can compete in the race. But even dogs who do sort of race or are withdrawn for health reasons sometimes die later or have to retire from their injuries. Lots of lung injuries, as you can imagine, for running for that long, or tendon and joint related injuries from running. So it really runs the gamut of what could happen. It's a very difficult race over incredibly brutal conditions for well over a week, 8 or 9 days of running straight. They have some mandatory rests, but it's many people think not nearly enough to keep the dogs healthy.
No, for sure. I know I get winded just carrying down the garbage can to the street every week. I can't imagine how these dogs fare doing the horrible, I would call it, work and pulling they do. Wayne, to you. And this gets to the issue of bipartisanship, which I think you've evidenced we're able to achieve with a lot of our work. There's some concern that the administration current would be inherently opposed to animal welfare issues. What is your assessment of that topic generally, and maybe even specifically with the current executive branch?
Well, when we think about this, the table is not always perfectly set. We're the ones who can drive these decisions in some ways. We're the ones who can steer history here. When change has happened, it's because people have grabbed the reins of power in some ways, and they've demanded change. I mean, civil rights activists, women's rights activists, environmental activists, so many different causes have contested the dominant way of thinking and then, driven change. So, there's a big question, do presidents make history or do we make the president? There's obviously a great dynamism, right? This is a very powerful president. He has very strong views. He's got tremendous energy. He was ready on day one because of his prior service when perhaps he was not ready and he was expected to lose the 2016 race. He came in with great fervor. But I've said, time and time again that animal protection has to succeed no matter who is in the White House, no matter which party controls the Congress. And animal protection and opposition to animal cruelty is a universal value. I mean, we have tradition on our side. We have laws that span back 170 years in this country on animal cruelty. What our work is about is logically applying anti-cruelty standards. We accept as a nation the notion that cruelty to animals is wrong. The problem is in application. And it's really so many of these systemic uses of animals. And of course, we've talked about some of these cultural practices, customs, rituals, faith-based activities. We're going to confront all of it. And, we've seen some big announcements on animal testing after we set that up by passing the FDA Modernization Act 2.0. That was in Congress and that influenced the executive agencies. Now, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, I've said this before, she worked with us to ban greyhound racing in Florida. She's an animal protection advocate. She's an anti-cruelty advocate. I'm hopeful she's going to help us create the animal cruelty crime section at DOJ. And I'm hoping that the FBI Director Kash Patel, who also has espoused very strong animal protection values, is going to create the FBI animal cruelty task force. So we cannot think we're overwhelmed, that this is an unclimbable mountain. If you're a Democrat, you see a political trifecta where the presidency and both chambers of Congress and then the Supreme Court are controlled by Republicans, you can't just submit. You got to fight for these values. And the same goes when the Democrats are in charge and you're a Republican. Our issues transcend political party. And you'll see that when you see the roster of lawmakers who co-sponsored as originals the FIGHT Act tomorrow morning if you go to congress.gov. And Joseph, I think that the opportunities are immense for us as a cause, absolutely immense. Challenges are there as well, but that's always been the case. I've never been in a moment in my nearly 40 years of activism when I didn't feel that the challenges were great, but I feel stronger than ever about our potential for progress across the board on our issues.
Very inspiring, Wayne. Thank you. And thank you also to our guest, Scott Edwards, and to Elizabeth Malampy. And thank you to everyone who signed up and who attended tonight. You're part of the team, as I said at the beginning of this. Your passion for taking time out right after work on the West Coast, right after dinner time on the East, shows that you care and you really can be part of the change Wayne is talking about making happen, no matter what the context is, to help us drive it forward. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees. Look for our follow-up email tomorrow and stay tuned for details on when we'll have the next event in our Claudia Miller Ignite series on animal welfare. You can find us on Facebook, X, LinkedIn. Watch for your emails. We have a whole lot of stuff going on, all of it working for our shared interest, and that is to help improve the lives of animals. Thank you so much, everyone, and we wish you a good night.